I had stopped expecting anyone to need me for anything but fixing what was already broken. Then Cora Lane called me at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night and broke that quiet arrangement wide open. My name is Jonah Reed. I'm 32, and I run Reed's Auto and Small Engine out on Route 9, just past the Millbrook town line, in a building my father built with his own hands the same year I was born. I fix transmissions, rebuild carburetors, keep the farm equipment running for half the county. It's honest work. The kind that lets a man sleep without owing anybody an explanation for how he spends his days. I wasn't always the kind of man who measured his life in spark plugs and oil changes. I was engaged once to a woman named Beth back when I was 26 and still believed the world handed out happy endings on a predictable schedule. She left 3 weeks before the wedding for a man with a better job and a bigger house 2 states over, and she did it by leaving a note on the kitchen counter instead of saying it to my face. I've fixed a lot of broken things since then. I never quite figured out how to fix that particular habit I picked up afterward, the one where I stopped letting myself want anything too badly. Because wanting things too badly seemed to be how a man ended up reading a note instead of hearing the truth. I told myself that was fine. A man can build a decent life out of quiet routines and engine grease if he's patient enough, if he stops expecting more than that. I'd convinced myself I had, right up until the night my phone rang past 11 and Cora Lane's voice came through it, thin and frightened in a way I'd never heard from her before. Cora ran a little catering operation out of a converted box truck, the kind you'd see parked outside the high school on Friday nights selling barbecue plates and sweet tea, or set up at the farmer's market on Saturday mornings with trays of biscuits that disappeared faster than she could bake them. She was 29, raising her younger brother Tucker, who was 16 and growing out of his shoes every few months, ever since their parents died in a house fire when Tucker was 11 and Cora was old enough to become the only family he had left. I'd known Cora the way you know most people in a town the size of Millbrook, by name, by reputation, by the easy nod you give somebody at the gas station. She'd brought her truck into my shop maybe 4 times over the past year for routine repairs, brake pads, a starter that kept sticking, the kind of work that doesn't take much more than an afternoon. She always paid in cash, always tipped in pie, and always talked about that truck like it was a member of her family instead of a piece of machinery. It's not just a truck, Jonah, she told me once, the first time she brought it in, standing in my bay with flour still dusted on her forearms. It's everything. It's Tucker's school clothes. It's the roof over our heads. If that truck stops running, we stop eating. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, beyond noting the particular weight in her voice when she said it. I understood machines that mattered more than their price tag. I didn't yet understand how close she was running to the edge of losing hers. That Tuesday night, her voice on the phone was barely holding together. Jonah, I'm sorry to call this late. I didn't know who else to call. What's wrong? There was a long pause, the kind that tells you somebody on the other end is deciding how much of the truth they can stand to say out loud. They're repossessing my truck in the morning, she said, and her voice cracked clean down the middle on the last word. 8 o'clock. They're sending a tow company from 2 counties over. I just got the call an hour ago. I sat up straight in my recliner, the television forgotten. How? Cora, you've never missed a payment that I know of. It's not that simple, she said. And then she told me a story that took the better part of 20 minutes and left me standing in my own kitchen by the time she finished, gripping the phone hard enough that my knuckles ached. Her ex-husband, Derek Pruitt, had taken out a title loan against the truck 18 months earlier, back when they were still married, using her signature he'd forged on a form she never saw. He'd told her at the time he was refinancing the original truck loan to get a better rate. And she'd believed him, because back then she still believed most of what he told her. He left 4 months later for a woman in Knoxville, taking what was left of their savings account with him and leaving Cora to discover, slowly and in pieces, exactly how much damage he'd done on his way out the door. The title loan was one of the pieces she hadn't found yet, buried under a mountain of mail she'd been too overwhelmed to open, until a collections notice finally forced her to look. She'd been making payments on a loan she never knew she owed for the better part of a year, scraping together whatever she could from a catering business that barely covered groceries most months. But Derek had also missed payments before he left. Payments he'd never told her about, and the gap had grown too wide to close. The lender, a finance company 2 counties over that specialized in exactly this kind of arrangement, had finally run out of patience. "I called them tonight begging for 1 more week," she said. "Just 1 week, enough time for me to get the Saturday market money together." The woman on the phone said she was sorry, but the order had already gone through, and there was nothing she could do once the tow company had the address. Her voice dropped to something almost too quiet to hear. "Jonah, if they take that truck, I don't know what Tucker and I do next. I don't have anything else." I stood in my kitchen a long moment after she went quiet, looking at the dark window over my sink, at my own reflection looking back at me. A man who'd spent 6 years convincing himself that wanting to help somebody too much was how you ended up disappointed. I thought about Beth's note on the counter. I thought about my father, who used to say a man's character showed up most clearly in the 5 minutes before sunrise, when nobody was watching to give him credit for what he chose to do next. "Where's the truck parked tonight?" I asked. "Behind my house." "Why?" "Because I'm coming over." She started to argue, the way people do when they've gotten too used to handling everything alone, and I told her I'd already grabbed my keys and I was walking out the door, and there wasn't much left for her to argue with by that point. I got to her place a little after midnight. She lived in a small rented house at the edge of town, the kind with a sagging porch and a yard that needed mowing more than her budget allowed for. With Tucker's bicycle leaned against the steps and the box truck parked in the gravel drive behind it, its faded green paint catching the moonlight. Cora was sitting on the porch steps when I pulled in, wrapped in an old flannel jacket, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her look behind the counter of that truck, handing out biscuits and easy smiles to half the county. "You didn't have to come," she said, standing as I walked up. "I know." She wrapped her arms around herself against the night chill. "I keep running the numbers and they don't work no matter how many times I run them. I've got maybe $600 to my name and the payoff to stop the repo is closer to $4,000. I sat down on the step beside her, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. "Tell me about Tucker." She blinked, thrown by the question. "What?" "Tucker. Tell me about him." A small, exhausted smile crossed her face, the first one I'd seen all night. "He wants to be an engineer. He's been building model bridges out of popsicle sticks since he was 9, testing how much weight they'll hold before they snap. He's smarter than I'll ever be, and he doesn't know it yet, because I've spent the last 5 years too tired to tell him often enough. He sounds like a good kid. He is. He's the only thing I've done right since our parents died." Her voice wavered. "And tomorrow morning, I have to look him in the eye and tell him I lost the truck that puts food on our table. Because I trusted a man who never deserved it." I looked out at that truck sitting in the gravel, faded green paint, a hand-painted sign on the side that read Cora's Kitchen in letters she'd done herself one summer afternoon, and I felt something settle into place in my chest, quiet and certain. The way a joint settles once you've finally found the right angle to drive it home. "They're not taking it in the morning," I said. She looked at me, startled by the certainty in my voice. "Jonah, you don't understand. I've called everyone I know. There's no one left to ask. You haven't asked me." The mid-story complication had already announced itself by then. Though neither of us had said the word out loud yet, Derek wasn't finished causing damage. He called Cora's phone twice more that week, each time claiming he wanted to help, each time circling back to some version of the same offer. He'd take care of the loan if she'd let him move back in, if she'd give the marriage one more chance, if she'd just stop being so stubborn about doing everything herself. I watched her hands shake every time his name lit up her screen, and I understood, slowly, that the debt on that truck wasn't the only thing he'd left behind. He'd left a woman who'd been taught, patiently and over years, that asking for help was a weakness he could use against her. I told her I'd cover what the payoff required, and she refused before I'd even finished the sentence, the way I'd half expected she would. "Absolutely not," she said. "I'm not taking $4,000 from a man I've known a year, Jonah. That's not help. That's charity. And I've had enough of people deciding what I owe them in return for fixing my problems." "It's not charity," I said. And it's not Derek's kind of help either, where there's a string attached to every dollar. I'm offering because I want to, with nothing expected back. And you're allowed to say yes to that without it costing you anything you're not willing to give. She shook her head, jaw set in a way I'd learned meant she'd dug in for a fight. I won't owe you. I've spent my whole marriage owing somebody, being grateful for things I should have just been allowed to have on my own. I'm not doing that again, even with someone who means well. I understood her stubbornness better than she probably realized. I'd spent 6 years protecting myself the same way, refusing to let anyone close enough to leave a note on my counter again. We sat on that porch a long while, two people equally determined not to need anybody, finally circling toward the same uncomfortable truth, that needing somebody and being weak were not, in fact, the same thing, no matter how many people in our lives had tried to convince us otherwise. Let me make you a deal instead, I finally said. Not charity. A loan. From me instead of that finance company, paid back on terms you set, at no interest, whenever your catering business can actually carry it. And in exchange, you let me put new brakes on that truck for free, because the pads are wearing thinner than I like, and I'm not in the business of fixing half a problem when I can see the other half coming. She studied me a long moment in the porch light, like she was trying to find the trick in it. Why would you do that? Because Tucker deserves to keep believing bridges can hold weight if you build them right, I said. And because somewhere along the way, I started caring a great deal about whether you and your brother had a roof over your heads. I'm not asking for anything back except the chance to keep being the kind of man who shows up at midnight when somebody needs him. Her eyes filled, and she looked away toward the dark yard, toward Tucker's bicycle leaning against the steps. I don't know how to let people do nice things for me without bracing for what comes after. I know, I said quietly. I think we've got that in common. She didn't say yes that night, not outright. But she let me sit with her on that porch until almost 2 a.m, working out numbers on the back of an old receipt, and by the time I drove home, the sky was already starting to lighten at the edges. And something between us had shifted into a shape neither of us had a name for yet. The repo truck never made it to her house. I drove to the finance company's regional office myself, first thing that morning, payoff amount in a cashier's check, and stood across the counter from a tired-looking clerk who processed the paperwork without much ceremony. The whole crisis dissolving into nothing more than a stamped form and a faxed confirmation. I called Cora from the parking lot to tell her it was done, and the sound she made on the other end of that call, somewhere between a sob and a laugh, was a sound I knew I'd remember the rest of my life. The weeks that followed settled into something neither of us had expected, a kind of easy partnership that crept up slowly until it didn't feel new anymore. I started showing up at the Saturday market most weekends, not to buy biscuits, though I bought plenty, but because Tucker had taken to explaining his latest bridge designs to me while Cora worked the window, and I discovered I genuinely liked the kid's company, his careful, serious way of describing load distribution like it was the most fascinating subject in the world. Cora would catch me listening, flour-dusted hands resting on the counter, and there was a particular look she'd get, soft around the eyes, that I started looking forward to more than I let myself admit. I fixed the truck's brakes the following week, then the alignment that had been pulling slightly left for longer than she'd told anybody, then a transmission leak she'd been ignoring because she couldn't afford to think about it. Every repair was a reason to spend another evening in her gravel driveway, the smell of motor oil mixing with whatever she'd been baking that day. Tucker handing me tools he'd learned the names of faster than most apprentices I'd trained. Somewhere in the middle of all that ordinary work, I stopped thinking of myself as a man fixing her problems, and started thinking of myself as a man who simply wanted to be wherever she was. There was a particular Sunday in early September I came to think of as the day everything quietly shifted, though nothing dramatic happened in it at all. Cora had a rare day off from the market, and she invited me out to Miller's Lake, a small public spot 20 minutes outside town, where her family used to picnic before the fire took her parents. She brought a basket of leftover biscuits and a thermos of sweet tea, and Tucker brought a fishing rod he never actually used, too busy sketching a new bridge design in a notebook he kept tucked in his back pocket. We spread an old quilt on the grass near the water, and Cora told me for the first time, about the year after the fire, how she'd had to drop out of community college to take whatever shifts she could find. how she'd taught herself to bake out of necessity because day-old bread was cheaper than almost anything else at the grocery store, and how somewhere in the grief and the exhaustion she'd discovered she was actually good at it, good enough that strangers started asking if she sold what she made. "I never planned on a catering truck," she admitted, watching Tucker skip a flat stone across the water. "I planned on being a nurse, actually, but plans have a way of rearranging themselves when you're the only adult left for a grieving 12-year-old. "You built something good out of what was left," I said. "That counts for more than the plan you started with." She was quiet a long moment, picking at the edge of the quilt. "Derek used to say the truck was beneath me, that a Pruitt shouldn't be slinging biscuits out a window like a roadside vendor. I think that's part of why it stung so much, losing it. It felt like proof he'd been right about me all along." "He wasn't right about anything that mattered," I said. "That truck fed half this town and put braces on Tucker's teeth. I don't know what kind of math makes that beneath anybody." She smiled at that, small and real, and reached over to take my hand on the quilt, and we sat like that a long while, watching Tucker's fishing line drift untouched in the water while he filled page after page with bridges that could hold more weight than anyone expected. We started a Thursday ritual not long after that, the same way I'd once had a quiet evening routine with nobody but a television for company. Cora would close up the truck a little early, and the three of us would eat dinner together at her wobbly kitchen table, Tucker narrating his school day with the same enthusiasm he gave his bridges, Cora teasing him gently about his crush on a girl in his chemistry class, until his ears went red. I started keeping a toolbox in the trunk of my truck specifically for her porch repairs. The sagging step, the loose railing. Small fixes I found excuses to make slowly, one at a time, because I'd discovered I wasn't in any hurry to run out of reasons to be there. She taught me, over those slow weeks, the difference between a biscuit that had been rushed and one that had been given the time it needed, how the butter had to stay cold, how you couldn't twist the cutter or the layers wouldn't rise right. I taught her how to check her own oil so she wouldn't have to drive 20 minutes to my shop for something that took 5, though we both knew that wasn't really why she kept finding excuses to bring the truck by anyway. Small things. The kind of things that don't sound like much until you realize you've built an entire private language out of them, one neither of you can quite explain to anyone who hasn't lived inside it. It was during one of those Thursday dinners, in the second week of September, that Cora first mentioned the storefront idea out loud, hesitant at first, like she was testing whether the dream could survive being spoken into a room with other people in it. "There's a space downtown, next to the hardware store," she said, pushing food around her plate instead of eating it. Small but real walls. A real kitchen instead of a propane stove the size of a shoebox. I think about it sometimes. I never let myself think about it too hard, though. Why not? I asked. "Because wanting things that big has a way of getting punished," she said quietly, and I understood, watching her say it, exactly how much of Derek's voice was still living somewhere inside her, telling her that ambition was a debt that always came due eventually. There was an evening in late September, the air finally cooling toward fall, when Cora and Tucker invited me to stay for dinner after I'd finished bleeding the brake lines. We ate at a wobbly kitchen table I promised to fix and never quite got around to, Tucker explaining a new bridge design with more enthusiasm than the dinner conversation strictly required. And afterward, once Tucker had disappeared to his room with a stack of homework, Cora and I sat on the porch steps the way we had that first frightening night. Except this time there was nothing to fix. Nothing urgent pressing down on either of us. Just two people who'd somehow found their way into each other's lives and weren't in any hurry to find their way back out. "I keep waiting for the catch," she admitted that night, watching the fireflies move through the dark yard. "Some part of me keeps expecting you to ask for something I'm not willing to give, the way Derek always did, even when he was pretending he wasn't asking for anything at all." "There's no catch," I said. "I think some people just show up because they want to be there, Cora. Not every kindness is a transaction waiting to come due." She was quiet a long while. "It's hard to unlearn that," she finally said. "Believing it, I mean. Not just hearing it." "I know," I said. "I've been working on unlearning a few things myself." I told her about Beth that night, the note on the kitchen counter, The 6 years I'd spent afterward convinced that wanting somebody too openly was how you guaranteed they'd disappear. She listened without interrupting, the way she had a habit of doing, and when I finished, she reached over and laced her fingers through mine, quiet and certain. And we sat like that a long while, two people who'd both learned the hard way to expect disappointment, slowly discovering they didn't have to brace for it anymore, not with each other. Derek didn't disappear easily, though. 3 weeks after I'd paid off the loan, he showed up unannounced at the Saturday market, leaning against Cora's truck like he still had some claim to the space, watching her work the window with an expression I recognized immediately, the particular look of a man who'd realized too late what he'd thrown away and had decided the solution was simply to take it back. "Heard you got some help with the truck," he said, loud enough for nearby customers to hear, his voice carrying that easy, practiced charm I imagined had worked on Cora once, before she'd learned what it cost. "Didn't realize you were letting strange men bail you out these days." Cora's hands went still on the register. "He's not a stranger, Derek, and it's none of your business how I handle my finances anymore." "Everything about you is my business," Derek said, stepping closer. "Considering I'm still your husband on paper, last I checked." That was when I came around the side of the truck, having heard enough of the exchange to know exactly where it was headed. Derek looked me up and down the way men like him do when they're deciding whether you're worth the trouble of a real confrontation. "And who's this?" he said. "The mechanic who's been fixing more than her brakes?" "Watch your mouth," I said, keeping my voice level, though something hot had settled behind my ribs. Derek laughed, short and humorless. "Relax. I'm just here to talk to my wife." "Ex-wife," Cora corrected, voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. "And we're done talking, Derek. We were done the day you forged my signature on a loan you never told me about." For just a moment, something flickered across Derek's face, fast enough that I almost missed it. A flash of something that looked less like arrogance and more like fear. "I made a mistake," he said, quieter now, the performance dropping away. "Things in Knoxville didn't work out the way I thought they would. I'm trying to fix what I broke. You don't get to fix it by showing up here trying to make me feel guilty in front of my customers," Cora said. "If you wanted to fix something, you could have started by telling me the truth 18 months ago, instead of letting me find out from a collections notice." Derek's jaw tightened, and for a second I thought he might push the confrontation further. Instead, something in him seemed to deflate, the bravado draining out all at once. "I was scared," he admitted, low enough that only the three of us could hear it. "Scared I'd never be good enough for you the way you wanted me to be, so I took the easy way out instead of the honest one. I've been scared since the day I left. Turns out running from a problem doesn't fix it. It just makes a bigger one waiting for you when you finally stop running." It was the most honest thing I ever heard Derek Pruitt say, and for a moment I almost felt something close to sympathy for him. A man who'd let his own fear of failing somebody turn into a far worse failure than the one he'd been running from in the first place. "I hope you figure that out, Derek," Cora said, not unkindly. "But you're going to have to figure it out somewhere that isn't my truck window, in front of my customers, while my brother's at home doing homework you've never once helped him with." Derek looked at her a long moment, then at me, then nodded once, slow and resigned, and walked back to his car without another word. He never came around the market again after that, though Cora told me later he'd sent one final text, a short, almost humble apology, the kind of message a man sends when he's finally run out of excuses to hide behind. That night, after the market had closed and Tucker had gone home ahead of us on his bicycle, Cora sat in the passenger seat of my truck and didn't speak for a long while, staring out at the dark fields rolling past. "I keep waiting to feel triumphant," she finally said. "Like I should feel like I won something back there. Mostly I just feel tired." "You don't have to feel triumphant," I said. "You just had to stand there and tell the truth." "Which you did." "That's enough for one day." She was quiet a moment longer. "He used to be kind, you know. Before, not always, but sometimes, in the early years. I think that's the part that's hardest to let go of. Not the man he became, but the proof that he was once capable of being someone better, and chose not to stay that way." That's not yours to carry anymore, I said. Whatever he chose to become, you didn't make that choice for him. She reached over and squeezed my hand on the gear shift, and we drove the rest of the way back to her place in a silence that felt, for the first time in weeks, entirely peaceful instead of heavy. The crisis that followed wasn't about Derek at all, though. It came 3 weeks later, when Cora sat me down one evening, Tucker already asleep, and told me she'd been offered a chance to lease a proper storefront downtown, the catering business finally outgrowing the box truck that had carried her and Tucker through 5 hard years. It was the opportunity she'd been quietly hoping for since before I'd ever met her, and it should have been nothing but good news. Except the lease required a deposit larger than anything she'd saved, and the only way to make the numbers work was to sell the truck outright to a buyer 2 towns over who'd offered cash that same week. I should be thrilled, she said, sitting across from me at that same wobbly kitchen table. This is everything I've wanted for years. But I keep thinking about that truck, Jonah, about what it means to you that you saved it, and what it'll mean to sell it now, like none of that mattered. I understood, watching her wrestle with it, that this wasn't really about the truck at all. It was about whether she trusted herself to choose something better without it meaning the past hadn't mattered. Whether moving forward had to feel like betrayal of everything that came before. That truck was never really what I was trying to save, I told her. I was trying to save you and Tucker a roof and a meal on the table. If a storefront does that better, then the truck's done its job, and it's allowed to retire with honor instead of getting dragged along out of guilt. She looked at me a long moment, something easing in her shoulders. You really mean that? I really do. She took the storefront. We sold the truck to the buyer 2 towns over the following week, and Cora cried a little watching it drive away. The faded green paint and the hand-lettered sign disappearing down Route 9 for the last time. But it was the kind of crying that comes from gratitude as much as loss. The particular ache of letting go of something that had carried you exactly as far as you needed it to. The storefront opened in late October, Cora's kitchen painted fresh and bright above the door, and on opening morning, with half of Millbrook crowded inside for free coffee and biscuits, Tucker stood proudly behind the counter in an apron 2 sizes too big, telling anyone who'd listen about the bridge he'd just finished for the regional science fair. I stood near the back of that crowded little shop, watching Cora move between customers with an ease I hadn't seen in her even in the best of our Saturday mornings at the truck window. And I understood, watching her, that I'd never wanted anything in my life the way I wanted to keep standing exactly where I was standing. In whatever capacity she'd let me. That evening, after the shop had emptied and Tucker had gone home to finish homework, Cora and I sat on the back step of the new storefront, looking out over the alley where she'd parked her bicycle that morning instead of driving. The box truck gone, but nothing about her life feeling smaller for its absence. She leaned her head against my shoulder, exhausted in the good way. The way a person gets after a day spent building something real instead of just surviving another one. I keep thinking about that night you came to my porch, she said quietly. I keep thinking about how scared I was, telling you about the truck, certain you'd think less of me for needing help that badly. I never thought less of you, I said. I thought more of you, watching you fight that hard for your brother. I still do. She was quiet a moment, then asked, almost shy in a way that didn't suit the strong woman I'd come to know. Do you ever regret it? Helping me that night, getting tangled up in all of Derek's mess? All of it? I turned to look at her, the evening light catching gold in her hair, and I thought about Beth's note on the counter. About 6 years spent convinced that caring too much was how you guaranteed your own disappointment, and I understood, with a certainty that settled deep and warm in my chest, exactly what I wanted to say. The night you called me, I said. You told me they were repossessing your truck in the morning, and I told you not while I'm still breathing. I meant every word of that then, and I mean it now. Except I think what I was really telling you, even if I didn't fully understand it myself yet, was that I wasn't going to let anything take away the life you were building for you and Tucker. Not the loan, not Derek, not anybody's doubt about whether you deserve to keep fighting for it. I don't regret a single minute of it, Cora. I think it's the first time in 6 years I've been glad I let myself want something that badly. Her eyes filled, and she didn't bother wiping the tears away this time. Just let them fall, while she looked at me like she was finally allowing herself to believe something she'd been too frightened to believe for a long time. I love you, she said, simple and unguarded, the words landing in the quiet alley like something finally settling into the place it belonged. I think I have for a while now. I was just too scared to say it out loud, in case saying it made it something Derek could use against me too. I love you too, I said. And I promise you, whatever happens next, that's not a debt you'll ever owe me for. It's just the truest thing I know. She kissed me then, slow and certain, with none of the fear that had colored every gentle thing in her life since the day Derek walked out. And I understood. Holding her in that quiet alley behind the shop she'd built out of nothing but stubbornness and biscuit recipes and a fierce love for a younger brother who deserved every bridge he'd ever build. That I'd found the thing I'd convinced myself for 6 years I'd never let myself want again. We married the following spring, a small ceremony in the backyard behind the auto shop, with Tucker standing up as my best man. Proud and a little teary in a way he tried hard to hide behind his usual serious composure. Cora wore her late mother's pearl earrings and carried a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked that morning from the field behind my shop instead of anything ordered from a florist. Derek wasn't invited. And nobody missed him. Cora's kitchen had grown enough by then to cater its own wedding. Biscuits and barbecue served on mismatched plates to the handful of people who'd actually shown up because they loved us, not because they'd been obligated to attend. My father's old workbench sat off to one side of the yard that day, the same bench where I'd learned to rebuild my first carburetor. And at some point during the reception, I caught Tucker leaning against it, sketchbook open, already deep into a new design. And I thought about how a family gets built sometimes, not always through blood, but through the slow accumulation of Thursday dinners and porch repairs, and a willingness to show up when somebody calls you at midnight, frightened and certain they have nowhere left to turn. These days, the shop runs 3 mornings a week with a line out the door, and Tucker's bridge took second place at the regional science fair. A fact he mentions roughly twice a day with the kind of pride only a 16-year-old can summon. I still run Reed's Auto out on Route 9, though my evenings belong to a house that smells like fresh bread more often than motor oil now. And some nights, watching Cora fall asleep against my shoulder after a long day at the shop, I think about that midnight phone call, about a woman's frightened voice telling me they were taking the only thing standing between her family and disaster, and about how certain I'd felt, even then, that I wasn't going to let that happen, not while I still had breath left in me to stop it. Some love stories start with fireworks. Ours started with a repossession notice and a midnight drive down a dark county road, 2 stubborn people who'd both learned the hard way not to ask for help, finally discovering that the bravest thing either of us ever did was let somebody show up for us anyway.